is inside the Tram, or at least tried to. I had somebody lose a shoe. That was hard to understand. How do you lose a shoe? And he was an adult. The first group of aircraft we're going to look at are the United States Air Force supersonic jet fighters. The introduction of the jet engine at the end of World War II brought a quest for ever faster speeds to the forefront of fighter airplane development. Since the 1950s, the military began to de-emphasize the maneuverability of the dogfight era and began emphasizing long-range missiles for combat with other aircraft. The first two aircraft we're going to look at will be on our right side. The second and third aircraft, they're large gray jet, supersonic jet fighters. One has the red and white on the tail on the right side, and the other one has the yellow and black. The red and white tail is the F-102 Delta Dagger, and the one next to it is the F-106 Delta Dart. Both these aircraft were high-speed interceptors. The plane's triangular or delta-shaped wings are very efficient at high speeds, but make them significantly less maneuverable than planes with other wing types. The mission was to fly out at supersonic speeds to intercept enemy bombers before they could reach the coast of the United States. On the left side, this aircraft is a supersonic jet fighter from the 60s, the one with the red star near the nose. It's in camouflage paint. It is from the 60s, as I said, the Phantom F-4. Originally designed as a high-speed interceptor for the Navy, the Phantom's design proved more adaptable than the F-102 or 106 that we just looked at. So the Air Force also adopted the Phantom, using it in both air-to-air combat and for bombing ground targets. The Phantom was originally designed without a gun and relied solely on missiles for combat with other aircraft. However, combat in Vietnam and the Middle East quickly showed that the era of the dogfight had not ended after all. While this large and fast but less maneuverable aircraft was at a disadvantage compared to the Soviet Union's smaller, quicker turning jet fighters that were slower than the Phantom, American pilots overcame the Phantom's deficiencies with better training and superior tactics. Now, just FYI, the red star near the nose was awarded to the plane. The pilot got an award for shooting down an enemy jet fighter during the Vietnam War, but it did use a missile. Later versions did come out with guns built in, and in between, some of the planes were retrofitted with pods underneath the belly to house guns. Okay, the next aircraft we're going to look at, I'm going to be making a turn kind of back to the left, but I'm going to stop so everybody can see this small jet fighter. It represents the earliest jet fighters that were produced by the United States. And it's now on my right side over here. It has the silver body, the orange lightning bolts, well, it used to be red, tip tanks with lightning bolts on them. This is the P-80 Shooting Star. All major powers on both sides of World War II sought to develop jet-powered aircraft, combat aircraft. Germany was the first to fly a jet-powered aircraft in 1939. Think about that. 36 years after the Wright brothers' first flight. By 1944, Germany, Great Britain, and the U.S. had all designed their first combat jets, but the British and Germans did put their jets into combat during World War II, but the United States jets, like the P-80, did not see combat until the Korean War in the 60s. but it is a historical fact that a P-80 Shooting Star was the very first jet-powered combat jet to shoot down an opposing jet fighter, and that was during the Korean War in the 50s. So apparently the World War II jet fighters didn't either confront each other or didn't manage a shoot down. Before I complete the turn, look to your right. There's an aircraft with Arizona flag on the tail and under the nose. That's an F-16, and you may hear those or see them take off from Tucson International Airport. Most of the F-16s we see around here fly with the Arizona Air National Guard. Although the Air Force Thunderbirds still use that aircraft in their air shows. Okay, the next group of aircraft will be on both sides of the tram. These are a grouping of light civilian aircraft designed in the 30s, 40s, or 50s or beyond. All these aircraft are designed to provide personal transportation for the individual or civilian market. Now these two on the left are twin-engine ones, the first two. They were built for personal transportation, but look, the military acquired them. Military often acquires civilian aircraft because they have needs for them. Not only are they cheaper to acquire, but they also are cheaper to operate. They use them for training sometimes. They use them to keep the flight skills up of pilots assigned to non-flying duties, or maybe just to move small numbers of people around. On the right side, there's a row of single-engine planes. Then there's a twin that's got Army on the side. These single engines are all light civilian aircraft, but not all of them were built in factories. Look at the second one in the row, this little goldish colored one with the low wing. That says experimental on the side. This was a kit plane. The pilot owner bought the kit, assembled it, bought a engine to put in it, put it together, got it flying, and then had the FAA sign off on it. He would build it in either his backyard, his garage, or his private hangar. Many aircraft are home-built. You probably saw some in our main hangar when you came in, home-built aircraft. Some were designed strictly created by the person's mind, like the BG. This fifth one in the row, this little white high wing, that looks pretty nice, but that is also a kit plane built by the pilot owner. Hundreds of home-built aircraft are built every year in the United States. Personally, I wouldn't go near an airplane I had anything to do with the building thereof. I don't even do my own maintenance. Okay, the next aircraft on the right side is yellow, low wing, single engine, actually has a radial engine, but look at all that plumbing underneath the aircraft. No, a plumbing company didn't buy that to demonstrate their plumbing skills. This is the SNOW S2A crop duster. Aircraft such as this are vital to the agricultural industry. They're used to spray fertilizers and pesticides on crops and farmlands. The flying involved in, technical term, aerial application is technically challenging and occasionally hazardous. Pilots who fly these aircraft are highly trained in all aspects of aerial application, from safe pesticide use to entomology to their flight skills. I have a neighbor down the street. His brother wanted to take up crop dusting until he saw the chemistry and entomology he would have to study to pass a test on those subjects, and he gave up his quest. Okay, on the left side is the first of the airliners we're going to look at. We're going to look at several. This one with the 4 propellers. I'm going to back behind me a bit. This is the Vickers Viscount airliner. The Vickers Viscounts were the world's first turboprop propeller turbine airliners, designed and built by Vickers Armstrong Limited of Great Britain. 445 Viscounts were built from 1948 to 1964, and the aircraft flew for over 60 years. Wow, the engines are really high above that cabin. Yellow leading edge. Oh, pontoons. Gray body, yeah. This is an airliner from the 30s, the Sikorsky S-43 Baby Clipper. Yes, it's a 50s moved to Alaska, where it was damaged in an accident and spent the next 30 years underwater in a lake. Looks pretty good. A member of the U.S. Marine Corps rescued the plane. It was restored and later loaned to our museum. But earlier I said the civilians often acquired these. This one never served with the military, but the Marine got to pick the paint job, and there were many that were acquired by the Marines or the Navy, so he could pick out a paint job pretty easily. The Baby Clipper. On the left side, before I turn the corner to look at the next airliner, this is our maintenance restoration area. We've got a B-52 we're painting. This plane named Sophia was under the canopy for a while. It sat over at Davis Monthan for a couple of months before we actually got it over here. There are also vehicles. We're going to open a vehicle museum in the near future. Okay, on our right side, there's a silver airliner with the triple tail. It's got 4 engines with propellers. Has TWA on the nose. This is the Constellation Orkani by Lockheed. This is also one of the post-World War II airliners like the Viscount. This is the first of the long-range airliners. They were enabled because the military built runways and airports and more runways on bases that got abandoned, so we had enough airports around the country to start introducing these larger and longer ranged airliners. The Connie can carry 44 to 81 passengers and a crew of 6. This is the 10th Connie built, the oldest one left in the world. It flew briefly with the U.S. Army Air Forces in 1946, was returned to Lockheed, and then resold to TWA. It flew as an airliner from 1947 to 1961. I had a guest on the Tram a little over a month ago, and she said, "Oh, I flew on the Connie for TWA." I said, "Oh, you were a stewardess then?" She said, "I beg your pardon. We were hostesses." That's what they called their flight attendants, hostesses. Okay, the next airliner is historical, but not because it's old. Look at this one with ANA on the tail. That is a big one. It's one of the new airliners from Boeing, the 787 Dreamliner. But this is the first jet airliner not constructed almost entirely of aluminum. Instead, it is nearly 80% carbon fiber composites, along with the new advances in engines and wing shape, make it one of the most fuel-efficient and cost-effective jet airliners ever built. The one you're looking at was the second Dreamliner produced. It participated along with the other prototypes in the aircraft testing and certification process. It carries the markings of All Nippon Airlines, which was the first airline to buy any of the new aircraft. As an airliner, it could carry 242 passengers and a crew of 8. But it was a prototype. So in their infinite wisdom, Boeing and their accountants determined it was more cost effective because the prototypes are much heavier and a lot of extra equipment and weight in them. So it was cheaper to donate it to our museum than convert it back to a certificated airline. Thank you, Boeing. And because we're a non-profit, I'm sure the tax deduction they got had something to do with that calculation. Okay, now we're going to move from airliners to cargo aircraft. And this is a good segue. This one we're coming up to on the left is a Douglas C-54 Skymaster. Of course, the military needs larger aircraft to carry large amounts of equipment, supplies, troops, etc. This aircraft was based on the DC-4 airliner. In fact, the first Skymasters that began service with the Army Air Force in early '42 were converted airliners. The first 20 were. Requests for straight cargo versions soon followed. C-54s are best known for participating in the Berlin airlift. If you remember, that's where the Soviet Union blocked all supplies, food, medicine, everything from entering West Berlin overland in trucks or on trains. In the largest humanitarian effort that took place between June 48 and September 49, 2.3 million tons of food, medicine, fuel, and other supplies were delivered to West Berlin, mostly in C-54s. Then known as Operation Vittles, the Berlin airlift is considered the first major confrontation of the Cold War. Our aircraft in the museum did participate in the Berlin airlift from September 48 to January 49. Now the next two cargo planes are one of the most popular cargo planes. They have been flying since the 1950s in both military and civilian uses. And advanced versions of them are still being manufactured today. This green one is an A model of the C-130 Hercules. Looks a little rough, but doesn't look too bad. I might fly in that. The next one is a gray one coming up on our left side also. But it looks pretty rough, but it's a newer version. But this one was converted to deliver supplies to the research centers at the North and South Poles. That's why this one's pretty rough. Look at the giant skis underneath the aircraft for landing and taking off in the snow and the ice. North and South Poles. But kids, don't worry. Always notifies Santa Claus when they're conducting operations at the North Pole. The Air Force doesn't want to interfere with his aerial operations, right? Right. Okay, we saw a big plane. Was actually a C-47 that was modified for NASA called the Sophia. This aircraft is called the Super Guppy. It was modified from an Air Force C-97 cargo plane for NASA in the 60s. This is the first Super Guppy of 5 that were built. They have been used to carry sections of rockets, the Apollo space capsules, the moon landers, even whole other airplanes. I don't know, the script says inflated fuselage. To me, from this side, it just looks pregnant. But from the other side, I'll give you a different view, and it looks a little different. The last cargo this aircraft carried was the Hubble Space Telescope. If you didn't know, underneath the University of Arizona football stadium, at least part of the football stadium, we have a mirror lab where we polish and grind those giant mirrors. In fact, we did the Hubble telescope mirrors twice. The PhD from back east, I will not name names of the school, but he made a math error, and so the mirrors were ground rock. They got it in space, and the pictures, the images were not clear. So we had to regrind and repolish the mirrors and send them up on the space shuttle where they were installed in space the second time. That was one expensive math error. It wasn't even calculus or, physics. He's a physicist, but, it was a simple math error. Okay, the next airplane we're coming up to on the left with the red cross on the tail is one of the C-97s like the Super Guppy was built from. This is the C-97 Stratofreighter by Boeing. It was designed after request by the U.S. Army Air Force for a cargo plane based on the B-29 bomber. Now I keep saying U.S. Army Air Force. If you didn't know, the Air Force wasn't created until September of 1947 by an act of Congress which created the Department of the Air Force as a separate branch of the military. Okay. So this one looks a little bit like a B-29, although it's taller, I think. Has a lot of windows. These first began to fly in 1945, and then they were so popular and versatile that Boeing modified the design of this aircraft slightly to create their first post-World War II airliner, the Boeing 377, which was also the first double-deck airliner. The top deck was the passenger level, and then they had a staircase going down to the cocktail lounge underneath where everybody sat for passengers to mix and mingle. In 1969, this aircraft was loaned to the International Red Cross to fly relief supplies into Nigeria during the Civil War. Okay, we have over 400 aircraft, from little bitty ones you saw inside to giant ones. All of them have the same restriction: how far they can fly before they got to land and get more fuel. Since the 20s, efforts to design a way to refuel aircraft in the air had been worked on, but it wasn't until the 50s that a practical system was created. These three aircraft on our left are all refuelers. Look at this silver one in the middle, the KB-50 Super Fortress. It was also built off the B-29 bomber concept. In fact, when these first went into use at the end of World War II, they were bombers. This is a J model that was produced as a refueler to refuel aircraft in the air. They added the jet engines to this model to help it get off the ground, but also keep its speed up, because they were refueling mostly jet-powered aircraft in the 50s once they figured out the way to do it. Interesting. Refuelers. Now, if you look to the right past this aircraft with the 8 propeller blades, I'll explain that in a minute, you can see the Super Guppy. Now, from this side, it looks more like a whale. Yeah, I'll go with that. But look at that seam around the front of the Guppy with those 2 protrusions. The whole front, those are hinges. The whole front of the aircraft swings open like a giant door. You can see the cockpit from this angle where the pilot sat. That would be unnerving to sit there with all that big, huge body above you and behind you. Oh my gosh. Okay, the military has given many missions, all important. One of them is to detect foreign aircraft or aircraft that are approaching that could be hostile. And I guess now we got to add balloons. This aircraft on the right was developed to carry radar. Since World War II, radar has been the primary method of detecting approaching aircraft. Well, of course, lately it's been satellites as well. Radar only works in line of sight, so the higher the antenna, the farther the radar can see. It can't see through a mountain. This is the Avro Shackleton, developed for Great Britain. Look at the radome underneath the belly of the aircraft, which houses the radar. The Avro Shackleton is also unique because it uses contra-rotating propellers. So on each engine, there are 2 sets of 3 bladed propellers that are mounted in line with each other, but spin in opposite directions. Makes them more efficient and creates more power. So the other aircraft with the 8 propeller blades was 2 sets of 4. Long-range bombers on our left side. We're going to look at 3 of them. Long-range strategic bombing was developed during World War I as a way to attack industrial and military targets far from the front lines of battle. The small and ineffective raids of World War I gave way to the huge air battles of World War II, with thousands of aircraft battling over the skies of Europe and Asia. The development of the atomic bomb at the end of World War II brought a quest for even longer and larger bombers, longer ranged, bigger bombers. This aircraft on our left is the first of the post-World War II bombers to go into service with the U.S. Air Force. It is the B-36 Peacemaker. This aircraft was the largest bomber to ever serve with the United States Air Force. It uses 6 of the largest and most powerful piston engines ever developed. Its wingspan is 230 feet. The 747's wingspan's only 211. The B-52s we're going to look at 187. This is one big airplane. This is also the last propeller-driven strategic bomber used by the Air Force. It began flying in '49, but was already becoming obsolete. And the first of the B-52s, their replacement, began flying in 1952. But if you'd like to see one fly, I think the only way is to rent a movie. There's a movie that was put out in the 50s called Strategic Air Command, starring Jimmy Stewart, and it was at an Air Force base that had like 50 or 60 of those flying. It was based on a story that a World War II bomber pilot got recalled because Strategic Air Command was, remember, developed because of the Cold War to have bombers in the air all the time. If Russia attacked, we could respond quickly. Well, the story was this guy was recalled and had to learn how to fly those. Well, Jimmy Stewart was a B-24 pilot in World War II, and they actually let him fly the B-36 a little bit in the movie. Cool. Good movie. Okay, B-52 Stratofortress. This one's nicknamed the Valkyrie. It's a later version of B-52 that began flying in 1959. This aircraft, though, is special because it served in the 1991 Gulf War with Iraq and participated in what was at the time the longest combat mission ever flown in history to that point. On the first night of the Gulf War in January of 1991, this aircraft and a number of others took off from Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana and flew non-stop to Iraq and back, launching cruise missiles at targets near Baghdad. In all, the planes were refueled 4 times in the air and flew a total of 35 hours before landing. I will never complain about a long airline flight again. 35 hours. On the right side going down, I'll just point these out because I'm going to talk about them in a minute. These are all foreign aircraft built outside the U.S. in countries like China, France, Great Britain, Germany, Soviet Union, Poland. But I'll talk about foreign aircraft in just a minute. This next B-52 is an earlier model, the one we just looked at with the black on the bottom. This is the B-52D, nicknamed the Lone Star Lady. This version began flying in 1956 and was the main version used during the Vietnam War. They were painted this way with the black on the bottom because many missions over North Vietnam were flown at night. Camo on top because if they were flying during the daytime or they were parked during the day, they kind of disappeared into the jungle with the camouflage on top. From 1962 to 1974, the United States dropped over 7 million pounds of bombs on Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. But this history amazes me even more. The last B-52 left the assembly line in 1962. And yet over 70 of them are still in use with the United States today. Wow. They're expected to be used until 2040, maybe 2050. I had an Air Force controller. He said they used to tease the B-52 pilots. They'd call in to land at his Air Force base and they'd say, "Hey, I bet you a beer there's not one pilot on board that was born when your airplane was built." They won the bet most of the time. Okay, on the right side, we've got a small green aircraft. As I said, these are all foreign aircraft. This was designed as a trainer, the small green one, for the British Royal Air Force in 1959. It's the fourth of 6 prototypes that were built and tested before the aircraft went into production. It is the Folan Gnat, and it served as the primary fast jet trainer for the British Royal Air Force until 1979. Next to the Gnat is the Alpha Jet. It has the swastika sort of thing on the nose. This represents Europe's answer to the ever-increasing cost of military aircraft development. It was part of a joint venture between the French and the West Germans. This one carries the markings of the West German Luftwaffe, where they were used as close air support fighter bombers. The French used them as trainers. Since that time, most Western European military aircraft have been developed as part of joint ventures or collaborations between 2 or more countries to spread the costs around, as well as to ensure a greater number of aircraft sales. Okay, this next group of foreign aircraft after the tree are all fighters designed by the Soviet Union, even though some of them were built in China and Poland. The first one is a MiG-15. The MiG-15 was the first jet fighter we faced during the Korean War. This one happens to be a 2-seat trainer for the MiG-15. I think a MiG-15 was what got shot down by that P-80 Shooting Star that was the first jet-to-jet shoot-down. My next-door neighbor had one of these. He flew in air shows. He was a military pilot and a retired commercial airline pilot flying the big jumbo jets. He just did it for fun. He finally sold it. I said, "Why'd you sell it? You love that plane." Said the gas price went up and it wasn't so much fun anymore. The last one in the row is a MiG-29 Interceptor. Like the supersonic jet fighters that we looked at, it was an Interceptor, the Soviet design. It has the twin tails, a red star on the tail of this one. They were introduced in the late 1980s, but different versions of these are still flying for the Soviet Union or Soviet bloc countries. Okay, left side, helicopters. I'm already almost 5 minutes late. Helicopters were developed in the 1930s. One of the main reasons was to eliminate the need for large open areas by designing them to take off and land vertically. The military has found extensive use for helicopters, carrying troops, cargo, and as armed gunships. Civilian operators have found them valuable. You can count the ways. Law enforcement, search and rescue, air ambulances, firefighting, cargo. Look at the green one across from the left side of the tram. It has the red cross on the nose. It is the Bell UH-1 Huey, one of the most widely used and popular helicopters ever. The Huey was introduced by the U.S. Army during the Vietnam War, and it became one of the symbols of the war. This one is marked as a medical evacuation aircraft responsible for taking wounded soldiers from the battlefield to hospitals. The use of these helicopters saved the lives of many soldiers who would have died before they could have reached the proper treatment. Well, you can tell the aerodynamics of helicopters is much different, all sorts of shapes and sizes, many different uses. One of these is actually a Soviet attack helicopter gunship, and it is the one that will be just across from us on the left, this kind of greenish one, right across from me now. But look at this giant helicopter on the right side. This is one of the largest heavy lift helicopters developed for the United States Army, called the Sky Crane. Soldiers in Vietnam nicknamed it the Praying Mantis. Looks like a bug. In the 60s, the Army needed a helicopter that could carry very heavy objects like artillery pieces, as well as small vehicles like jeeps and small trucks. This helicopter is capable of carrying 27,000 pounds of cargo. 27 or whatever, 27,000 pounds. That's over 13 tons. Picture your car and how many of those could it carry? Wow. Since their retirement from the military in the 90s, the Sky Crane has seen extensive use in fighting forest fires in the logging and construction industries. Okay, one more helicopter we're going to look at. This helicopter is straight ahead, but I'm going to make a right turn to make it easy for everybody to get a look at it. It may look familiar. That's because it's commonly referred to as the twin Huey. They were upgraded to have 2 engines and a larger, longer cabin. The Bell HH-1N Iroquois in this configuration, HH-1N represents this version. But when this helicopter first went into service with the U.S. Marine Corps, it was a VIP transport. In fact, of May of 1987, it served as Marine One when it carried President Ronald Reagan at the G7 summit in Venice, Italy. But a few years later, in 1990, it was converted to the HH-1N, the VIP interior removed, and it was assigned as a search and rescue helicopter at the Marine Corps Air Station in Yuma, Arizona. There it served both the civilians and the military for search and rescue for the next 30 years. This helicopter only retired in 2020. Taxpayers rejoice. We got our money's worth. Okay, I'm going to speed up and move ahead. It's not too bumpy through here. You know, we do have bumps. We don't complain about it in Tucson because we live in a desert. So we don't complain about the rain. It is, I know for tram fighters, it's kind of annoying at times. Okay, these 3 aircraft on my left, starting with the blue with the yellow trim and going to the right, are part of our Navy airplane collection. All 3 of these aircraft perform the same duties as their land-based counterparts, but these have been built with strengthened structures to withstand the forces of being catapulted off of aircraft decks and yanked to a stop when landing on the ships. Taking off and landing on ships is one of the most difficult jobs any aviator can have. The runway is only 500 feet long. There's only 4 cables stretched across the deck to catch your tail hook at the bottom of the plane. Add in the fact the runway's moving away from you at 35 miles an hour and bouncing up and down as much as 30 feet at a time. Studies have shown that landing on an aircraft carrier is more stressful for naval aviators than being shot at in combat. All right, the blue one with the yellow trim is a McDonnell Douglas FA-18 Hornet. The Hornet is still currently one of the primary fighters used by both the U.S. Navy and Marine Corps. They've been in service since the early 1980s, and advanced versions are expected to remain in service for the foreseeable future. They are still the primary, or the jet fighter that the Blue Angels aerobatic team uses. This one did serve with the Blue Angels aerobatic team for the Navy for a number of years before it was retired in 2013. Okay, moving ahead, we're going to talk about an aircraft that has a Tucson connection, has a very unique history. But on the right side, we have a number of training aircraft. Some were built as trainers, others were modified to be trainers. Military trainers generally have 2 seats, one for the instructor and one for the student pilot. Makes sense. Okay, on my left right now, I'm going to stop. This plane with the funny probe on the nose, which is for aerial refueling, is an EA 6-speed Prowler. It's an electronic warfare aircraft designed to jam or destroy enemy radars. The unique history of this one is in the 90s, the Marines needed more prowlers. One way to get them quickly was to refurbish older aircraft, technically called AMARC. We affectionately call it the Boneyard, and their parts were combined to build this one aircraft. Building it that way, it got the nickname Frankenprowler. Okay, military trainers. Primary training for military pilots is usually begun in small, light civilian aircraft, single-engine propeller engine aircraft, because they're very cheap to operate, and they can initially learn their flying skills, taking off and landing and controlling the airplane in the air. Plus, if they don't catch on, then they can be washed out, I guess. But when they master those techniques, then they move up to these more sophisticated, we call them complex aircraft, retractable gear, as well as many times jet-powered aircraft, especially if they're going into jets. There they learn the basics, they call them, of high-speed flight and the basics of aerial combat. But it's not until they start training in the type of aircraft they will fly in the military that they learn the combat techniques for that airplane, as well as how to employ the missile or weapon systems. I shouldn't say missiles, but weapons can be guns, can be missiles. Look at this plane on the right. We looked at one of these, the yellow and the white on the tail. But this one is a trainer, the F-102 Delta Dagger, but it's widened. This cockpit is like over double wide to accommodate two pilots sitting side by side, instructor and student pilot. Okay. Moving ahead. Oh boy, are we late. Okay, next we're going to look at, sorry, I flipped too many pages. VIP transports for the Air Force. These are used to carry high-ranking military officers and government officials around. They're generally converted from airliners. But as I'm driving up to it, look to your right and look at that B-36 from back here. The Air Force's largest bomber. Now you can see what that 230-foot wingspan looks like. Holy moly. It's big. Okay. Now, does this silver aircraft look familiar? Yes, this is a Connie, but in military terms, this is a Lockheed DC-121 Constellation. This aircraft, this exact plane, carried General Dwight David Eisenhower when he was commander of Allied forces in Europe after World War II. See the name on the side? Columbine. That's a flower. That's the state flower of Colorado. He named the planes. He had 3 of these. He flew around Europe in. I had to ask. I grew up in Oklahoma. The guy was from Kansas. What's he naming it after the state flower of Colorado? His wife grew up in Colorado. Smart man. Okay, we're going to go through a few more washboards. What do we have coming up? Well, it's blue and white, United States of America on the side. Not all aircraft painted this way are Air Force Ones, but this one is one of our 2 Air Force Ones. This was an adoption of the Boeing 707 airliner. The Air Force calls it the VC-137B. It was introduced to the presidential fleet in 1959, the second of 5 to serve the executive branch, VC-137s. During most of its service life, it just carried large groups of VIPs, but at least on one occasion we verified it did carry President John F. Kennedy. But here's the most amazing history. This is the aircraft in 1981 that brought the 52 American hostages back from Iran that had been held in the embassy when they were released. On that occasion, this aircraft used the call sign Freedom 1. Just before it retired, it was Air Force 2 for Vice President Al Gore. A lot of history. This next one is what brought me out the first time to see the museum back in 1970. Some of you guys weren't born yet. Okay, this is a Douglas VC-118A Liftmaster. This Air Force One is based on the Douglas DC-6 airliner, and it is the last propeller-driven aircraft to be assigned as the primary aircraft for the President of the United States. This airplane served both Presidents Kennedy and Johnson on a regular basis. I got to look inside back in 1970, back then before people started cutting pieces of fabric and stealing things and all that. And they said that Jackie Kennedy designed the interior on this. Although both men preferred the bigger, faster jet-powered aircraft, too many airports at the time were too small to accommodate that big jetliner, believe it or not. Okay, now you can get a better look at SOFIA. SOFIA stands for Stratospheric Observatory for Infrared Astronomy. See the panel on the side of the plane opens up, an infrared telescope points out and shoots infrared rays deep into space to see deep into the universe. SOFIA. Okay, sorry to say that the 390th Museum is already closed for the day, as are the other hangars. The only hangars still open are Hangar 1 and Hangar 2, where you came in or where you're going to exit. Okay, the Harriers we're going to look at here. This is a row of aircraft, jet fighters built to take off and land vertically. This whole row, they were all built in England. They were designed by Hogger Aviation of the United Kingdom. 4 rotating nozzles underneath the wings, 2 on each side, rotate down to divert the exhaust of the jet engines downward for vertical flight. This silver one is the Kestrel prototype, one of the prototypes tested in 1964 that led to the first production Harriers in 1969. As I said, they were all built in England, but they either served in the British Royal Navy, Royal Air Force, or with the United States Marine Corps. Thank you for riding the Pima Air Space Museum Tram. We do also operate the Titan Missile Museum in Green Valley, Arizona, about 40 minutes south. And you can go down inside and see the silo as well as the missile. But don't be disappointed. They removed the nuclear weapon. I was kind of upset. I wanted to see that thing, but... Okay.